August August 26th, recently known as Women's Inequality Day, marks the anniversary of the certification of the 19th Amendment, granting some women the right to vote. Observance of this day calls attention to the continuing efforts of women to achieve full equality. In recalling women's stories, we discover that as a group, women were never the lesser gender. In fact, history reveals thousands of women who displayed courage, commitment, and ambition, daring to succeed by overcoming the prejudiced notion that they were never intended to dare nor succeed. As we listen to the story of Harriet Tubman, we honor in retrospect the strength and resolution of all such iconic women. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross in the early 1820s on a plantation in Maryland. She was the 11th child born to her enslaved parents, Benjamin Ross and Harriet Green. Although her given name was Araminta, she was often called Minty as a child, but as an adult, she was calling herself Harriet. Denied the opportunity for an education, she was illiterate her entire life. Harriet began working for her master, Edward Brodess, or for neighbors to whom she was loaned out, when she was a mere 5 years old. Any failure to accomplish her assigned task led to cruel beatings.
To protect myself from the abuse, I wrapped myself in layers of heavy clothing, but I cried like it hurt so they wouldn't know.
Harriet's mother, who was called Rit, struggled to keep the family together as slavery tried to tear it apart. Edward Brodess sold 3 of her daughters, separating them from the family forever. When a trader from Georgia approached Brodess about buying Rit's youngest son, Moses, she hid him and even confronted her owner about the sale. As Brodess and the man from Georgia approached the slave quarters to seize the child, Rit told them, "You are after my son, but the first man that comes into my house, I will split his head open." Brodess backed away and abandoned the sale. This event in the family's history may have inspired Harriet's belief in the possibilities of resistance.
One day when I was about 12, I went to the store for supplies. While I was there, I ran into a slave owned by a different family who had left the fields without permission. His overseer, furious, demanded that I help restrain the young man. I refused. And as the slave ran away, the overseer threw a 2-pound weight at him from the store's counter. It missed and struck me instead and broke my skull. Fortunately, my hair had never been combed and stood out like a bushel basket, and that probably saved my life. I was bleeding and unconscious when I was returned to my owner.
The head wound, which occurred at a time in Harriet's life when she was becoming deeply religious, left her with a lifetime of severe headaches and narcolepsy. An illiterate child, she was told Bible stories by her mother. Harriet came to have a passionate faith in God, all the while rejecting the white interpretations of Scripture urging slaves to be obedient. Instead, she found her guidance in the Old Testament tales of deliverance. This religious perspective instructed her throughout her life. In or around 1844, Harriet married a free Black man named John Tubman. Such blended marriages, free people marrying enslaved ones, were illegal, but not uncommon on the eastern shore of Maryland, where half the Black population was free.
I changed my name from Araminta to Harriet soon after my marriage. In 1849, Edward Brodess died and his widow, Eliza, began working to sell the family slaves. So his death made it more likely that I would be sold and our family broken apart. I figured there was just 1 or 2 things I had a right to do, liberty or death. And if I could not have one, I would have the other. My brothers, Ben and Henry, and I escaped from slavery on September 17th, 1849. My husband refused to join us.
Once they had left, however, Harriet's brothers succumbed to second thoughts. Ben had just become a father, and the two men, fearful of the dangers ahead, went back, forcing Harriet to return with them.
Not long after, I escaped again, this time by myself. I made great use of the Underground Railroad made up of free and enslaved Blacks, white abolitionists, and other activists, mostly a group of people that were members of the Religious Society of Friends, often called Quakers. It was a dangerous journey. I had to travel by night, guided by the North Star, and hide by day to avoid the careful eyes of the slave catchers, eager to collect the rewards for runaway slaves. When I finally crossed into freedom in Pennsylvania, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields. Oh, I felt like I was in heaven. Immediately after reaching Philadelphia, I began thinking of my family.
In December 1850, Harriet did something very few slaves ever did. She voluntarily returned to the land of her enslavement. She traveled to Baltimore, where her niece Kessia and her children were about to be sold, and brought the family safely to Philadelphia. Thus began the work that would lead Harriet Tubman to be called the Moses of her people. For 11 years, known as the conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet returned south 13 times, rescuing some 70 enslaved people, including her three brothers, Henry, Ben, and Robert, their wives, and some of their children. She also provided specific instructions for 50 to 60 other fugitives who escaped to the north.
My work was dangerous, so I usually worked during the winter months to make it less likely that the group would be seen. Winter nights are long and dark, and people who had homes stayed in them. After I made contact with slaves who planned to escape to freedom, I made sure we left town on Saturday evening because the newspapers would not print runaway slave notices until Monday morning. Once somebody agreed to join my group, there was no turning back, and I would threaten to shoot anyone who tried to return. One time there was a particularly difficult journey, and one man insisted he was going to go back to the plantation. I pointed my gun at his head and told him, "You go on or die." He was still with us when we crossed over Lake Canada. One of my last missions was to retrieve my aging parents. I traveled back to the Eastern Shore and led them to Canada, where a community of former slaves, including my brothers and their families, lived.
Harriet conducted her last rescue mission in November 1860. No one ever collected the $40,000 reward for the capture or death of the woman who was behind the many escapes of enslaved people in the region. 10 years later, she told an audience just like you,
I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger.
When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Harriet became a Union Army nurse, cook, scout, spy, and guerrilla soldier. In 1863, Harriet became the first woman to lead an armed military operation in the United States. She worked with the Union Army and rounded up 8 scouts who helped her map South Carolina's Lowcountry and sent word to enslaved people when the raid would take place.
On the morning of June 2nd, 1863, I guided 3 steamboats across the Confederate mines in the waters leading to the shore of the Combahee River. When the steamboats sounded their whistles, slaves understood that the area was being liberated. I watched the slaves stampeded toward the boats. I never saw such a sight. Women carrying steel steaming pots of rice, pigs squealing and bags slung over shoulders, and babies hanging around their parents' necks. Their owners, armed with handguns and whips, tried to stop the mass escape, but as Confederate troops raced to the scene, the steamboats packed full of slaves took off towards Beaufort. More than 700 slaves were rescued in the Combahee River raid. The newspaper praised my patriotism, energy, and ability. But I was most proud of my recruiting efforts. Most of the newly liberated men went to join a Union army. For 2 more years, I worked for the Union forces, tending to newly liberated people, scouting into Confederate territory, and nursing wounded soldiers in Virginia.
The Confederacy surrendered in April 1865, and after several more months of service, Harriet headed home. She petitioned the government several times to be paid for her duties as a soldier. She was denied because she was a woman.
I spent my remaining years in Auburn, tending to my family and other people in need. I worked various jobs to support my aging parents and took in boarders to pay the bills. One of my boarders was a Civil War veteran named Nelson Davis, who was working in Auburn as a bricklayer. We fell in love. He was 22 years younger than me, but we were married and spent the next 20 years together. In 1874, we adopted our baby girl named Gertie.
When Nelson Davis died, Harriet did receive a pension as the widow of a veteran. In her later years, Harriet could have enjoyed a quiet life, but chose instead to travel with Susan B. Anthony to promote the cause of women's suffrage. A white woman once asked Harriet whether she believed women ought to have the vote and received this reply:
I suffered enough to believe it.
Harriet began attending meetings of suffragist organizations, visiting New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. to speak out in favor of women's voting rights. She described her actions during and after the Civil War and used the sacrifices of countless women throughout modern history as evidence of women's equality to men. At the turn of the 20th century, Harriet became heavily involved with the AME Zion Church in Auburn.
In 1903, I donated a parcel of land I owned to the church, telling them to make a home for old and poor Black people. I was quite upset when the church ordered residents to pay a $100 entrance fee. They make a rule that nobody could come in without $100. Now, I wanted to make a rule that nobody should come in unless they didn't have $100.
By 1911, her body was so frail that she had to be admitted to the rest home named in her honor. Surrounded by friends and family members, Harriet Tubman died of pneumonia on March 10, 1913. Widely known and well respected while she was alive, Harriet became an American icon after her death. A survey at the end of the 20th century named Harriet Tubman as one of the most famous civilians in American history before the Civil War. She inspired generations of African Americans struggling for equality and civil rights, praised by leaders across the political spectrum.